Alright, so let me tell you about this one time I went hiking and things took a really weird turn. I love being outdoors, especially hiking. There's just something about getting away from everything, breathing in the fresh air, and having nothing around but trees, mountains, and maybe the sound of a river. It's my go-to whenever I need to clear my head. This happened a couple of years ago. It was early autumn, and I'd taken a few days off work because I needed a break. I decided to drive out to this state park a few hours away from where I live. I'd been there before, but only once, and I remembered the trails being pretty quiet, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowded paths or kids running around, just some peace and quiet. I got to the park in the late morning, parked my car in this gravel lot that was almost empty, except for a couple of other cars, and set off with my backpack. I had everything I needed: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my phone, though the signal out there was pretty spotty. I wasn't too worried because I'd told a friend where I was going, and I figured I'd be back before dark. The trail I picked was one of the longer ones, winding through the woods and up into the hills. It was a beautiful day, with the sun shining through the trees, making everything look golden. The leaves were starting to change colors, and there was this crispness in the air that felt refreshing. I could hear birds chirping, and the occasional rustle in the bushes from some small animal. It was perfect. For the first couple of hours, everything was great. I passed by a few other hikers, mostly older couples or people walking their dogs. We'd exchange nods or a quick hello, the way you do when you're out in the middle of nowhere. After a while, I stopped seeing other people. It was just me and the trail. I didn't mind though. That's what I came for. Around the early afternoon, I decided to take a break. I found this nice spot by a small stream, set down my backpack, and sat on a rock to eat a sandwich. The sound of the water was soothing, and I felt myself relax even more. I wasn't in a rush to get anywhere, so I just sat there for a while, enjoying the peace and quiet. After I finished eating, I decided to keep moving. I checked my phone out of habit, even though I knew there wouldn't be any signal, and started walking again. The trail started to climb uphill, winding through denser sections of forest. The trees were taller here, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight, making it feel like I was walking through a tunnel of leaves. That's when I first noticed something strange. I couldn't hear any birds anymore. The forest was completely silent, except for the sound of my own footsteps on the dirt path. It struck me as odd, but I figured maybe the birds were just elsewhere. Nothing to worry about. But as I kept walking, the silence started to feel heavier, almost like the woods were holding their breath. I shook off the feeling and kept going, telling myself I was being paranoid. After another half hour of walking, I came across this fork in the trail that I didn't remember seeing on the map. There were no signs, nothing to indicate which path led where. One path seemed to keep going uphill, while the other veered off into the denser part of the forest. I stood there for a minute, trying to decide which way to go. I usually like sticking to the main trails, but for some reason I felt drawn to the path that went into the forest. It was narrower, more overgrown, like it hadn't been used in a while. Maybe it was curiosity or just a desire to see something different, but I took the path into the woods. The trail was harder to follow. Branches and bushes encroached on the path, and I had to duck under low-hanging branches a few times. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, making it hard to see where I was stepping. After about 15 minutes, I started to regret my decision. The trail was barely visible, and I had this nagging feeling that I was getting lost. I thought about turning back, but that's when I noticed something up ahead. A structure barely visible through the trees. It looked like an old cabin, or maybe a shed. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. As I got closer, I realized it was definitely a cabin, but it looked abandoned. The wood was weathered, the windows were broken, and the door was hanging off its hinges. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to go closer. Something about the cabin felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. There was this feeling in the pit of my stomach, a kind of unease that was telling me to leave, but I ignored it. I stepped closer, peering through one of the broken windows. Inside, it was dark, but I could make out some old furniture, a table, a couple of chairs, a bed in the corner. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, like no one had been there in years. I felt a chill run down my spine, and that's when I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from inside the cabin, like something moving. I stepped back quickly, my heart starting to race. I listened, trying to figure out what it was, but the sound stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting. After a minute, I decided I'd had enough. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard the rustling again, louder this time, followed by a low, creaking noise, like someone or something was shifting its weight. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I started walking back the way I came, moving quickly, almost jogging. The trail was even harder to follow now, and I kept tripping over roots and rocks hidden under the leaves. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something coming out of the cabin, but there was nothing, just the empty forest behind me. After what felt like forever, I finally made it back to the fork in the trail. I was breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, and that's when I realized something was wrong. The silence was back, that same heavy, oppressive silence I'd felt before. No birds, no wind, nothing. I decided then that it was time to head back to the car. I'd had enough of the woods for one day. I started down the main trail, moving quickly, almost at a jog. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a signal, but there was nothing. I just wanted to get out of there, back to the safety of my car. As I walked, I kept hearing noises behind me, faint rustling sounds, the snap of a twig. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a squirrel or a deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I sped up, almost running now, my eyes darting around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. I knew I should have reached the parking lot by now, but there was no sign of it. The trees around me were starting to look unfamiliar, and I felt the first real pangs of panic. I stopped to catch my breath, trying to get my bearings, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the soft rustle of an animal, but the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a person. I turned around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there, just the empty trail behind me, winding through the trees. I stood there, listening, straining to hear, but the footsteps had stopped. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I didn't know what to do. I was lost, alone, and there was someone else out there with me. I started walking again, faster this time, almost running. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. Just the empty trail and the silent trees. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had someone followed me from the cabin? Was it just another hiker? But why wouldn't they say anything? Make themselves known? The footsteps started again, closer this time, and I broke into a full sprint. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get away. I ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't stop. I could hear the footsteps behind me, getting louder, closer. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I burst out of the trees and into the clearing where the parking lot was. I saw my car, and relief flooded through me. I ran to it, fumbling with my keys, and finally managed to unlock the door. I jumped in, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. The car roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart still racing. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, but there was nothing, just the empty lot and the trees beyond. I drove for miles, not stopping until I reached the main road. I pulled over to the side, my hands still shaking, and tried to calm down. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trees, trying to make sense of it all. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me in the woods. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe there was another hiker who never meant any harm. But the feeling of being watched, the sound of those footsteps, that abandoned cabin, I can't shake it. I haven't been back to that park since. Every time I think about going hiking, I remember that day, and I feel a chill run down my spine. It's a shame because I used to love the woods, the peace, and quiet, but now, all I can think about is what might be lurking out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. Okay, let me tell you about this one time I went hiking, and it turned out to be one of the scariest experiences of my life. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I still get chills thinking about it, even though it's been a couple of years since it happened. It was a Saturday, and I decided to take advantage of the nice weather to do a solo hike. I'd been under a lot of stress lately, work stuff, personal stuff, the usual, and I needed a break. There's this trail about an hour's drive from my place, not too far out in the middle of nowhere, but far enough that it's quiet and you don't run into a lot of people. Perfect for clearing your head. I'd hiked this trail a few times before, so I knew the area pretty well. It was one of those places that felt familiar, almost like a second home in the outdoors. I packed my usual gear, a small backpack with water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and my phone with a portable charger. Nothing out of the ordinary. I got to the trailhead around noon. There were a few cars parked there, but I didn't see anyone else around. That wasn't unusual. People tend to start early, and I was running a bit behind. I didn't mind though. I liked the idea of having the trail mostly to myself. I took a deep breath of the fresh air, adjusted my backpack, and set off. The first part of the hike was just like always. The trail wound through a dense forest, the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze, birds chirping, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was the kind of place where you feel completely at peace, like you're a million miles away from all your worries. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a clearing where the trees opened up and you could see out over the valley. It was one of my favorite spots, with a fallen log that made a perfect place to sit and take a break. I sat down, took a sip of water, and just enjoyed the view. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have a place like this to escape to, even if just for a little while. I was sitting there for maybe 10 minutes when I heard something strange. It was a faint rustling sound, coming from the trees behind me. At first I didn't think much of it, probably just a squirrel or a bird moving through the underbrush. But the sound kept going, and it was getting closer. I turned around, peering into the trees, but I didn't see anything. I stood up, feeling a little uneasy, and scanned the area again. Nothing. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was alone out here and there was nothing to worry about. I sat back down on the log, trying to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't relax. That rustling sound had put me on edge. After a few more minutes, I decided to keep moving. Sitting still was only making me more anxious. I got up, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started back down the trail. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing behind me except the empty trail. I picked up my pace, trying to put some distance between me and whatever was making me feel so uneasy. The rustling sound had stopped, but now the silence was almost worse. The forest felt different, like it was closing in around me. I could feel my heart starting to race, and my breathing got quicker. I knew I was probably just freaking myself out, but that didn't make it any less real. About half an hour later, I reached another clearing, this one smaller than the first. I stopped to catch my breath and get my bearings. As I stood there, I noticed something strange. There was a small pile of rocks near the edge of the clearing, stacked in a neat little cairn. I'd never seen it there before, and it struck me as odd. Who would have taken the time to stack those rocks out here? And why? I walked over to the cairn, curiosity getting the better of me. The rocks were smooth, like they'd been gathered from a stream, and they were stacked with a precision that seemed deliberate. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I couldn't explain why. It was just a pile of rocks, after all. That's when I heard it again, the rustling sound, this time closer and coming from the direction I'd just come from. My instincts kicked in, and I backed away from the cairn, turning to face the trail. My heart was pounding, and I felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I stood there, listening, but the rustling had stopped again. The forest was silent, the only sound my own breathing. I strained my ears, trying to catch any hint of movement, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the trees and the distant hum of insects. I decided to keep moving. Standing around wasn't going to help, and I figured if I kept going, I'd eventually run into other hikers or reach the end of the trail. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting to the sides of the trail, looking for any sign of movement. As I rounded a bend, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. Another cairn, identical to the first, stacked right in the middle of the trail. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day, so where had it come from? I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I walked past the cairn, keeping my eyes on it as I moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was some kind of sign, like someone was marking the trail. But marking it for what? I didn't want to find out. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now, my senses on high alert. The trail wound deeper into the forest, and the trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. I felt like I was moving through a tunnel, with the forest pressing in on all sides. My footsteps were loud in the silence, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud snap, a branch breaking somewhere off to my right. I froze, my heart racing. I turned toward the sound, peering into the dense underbrush, but I couldn't see anything. My mind was racing with possibilities. Was it an animal? Another hiker? Or was it something else? I didn't wait to find out. I started moving again, faster this time, almost at a run. My breath was coming in short gasps, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a small clearing where the trail split into two paths. There was a signpost, one arrow pointing left, the other right. My mind was so foggy with fear that I couldn't remember which way I'd come from. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, my thoughts racing. I decided to take the left path, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail. As I started down the path, I heard the rustling sound again, this time louder, closer. It was like something was moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with me. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest, the trees blurring as I raced down the path. I could hear footsteps now, matching mine, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I had to get out of there. I had to reach the end of the trail, find help. The path twisted and turned, and I was barely paying attention to where I was going. All I could think about was the sound behind me, the footsteps getting closer, almost on top of me. I could feel panic rising in my throat, and I pushed myself harder, my feet pounding against the ground. Suddenly, I burst out of the trees and into another clearing. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, my eyes scanning the area. There was no one there, just the empty clearing and the path continuing on the other side. The footsteps had stopped, the rustling gone. Everything was silent. I stood there, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. No movement in the trees, no sound of footsteps. It was like whatever had been following me had vanished into thin air. I didn't wait around. I headed for the path on the other side of the clearing, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. My nerves were shot, every little sound making me jump. I just wanted to get out of the forest, back to my car, back to safety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the trailhead up ahead. Relief washed over me, and I practically sprinted the last stretch. When I reached the parking lot, I saw that my car was the only one there. The other cars from earlier were gone, and the lot was empty. I jumped in my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and my heart was still racing. I looked back at the trailhead, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just the empty path leading into the trees. I started the car and drove out of there as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me, but the road was empty, just me and the fading light of the setting sun. I never went back to that trail again. I still love hiking, but I stick to more populated trails now, places where I know I'll run into other people. And every time I hear the rustling of leaves in the woods, I can't help but feel that same chill run down my spine, like I'm being watched, like something is waiting, just out of sight, ready to follow me again. Okay, so this story still gives me chills whenever I think about it, even though it happened a few years back. I've always been into hiking, just getting away from everything and everyone, enjoying some peace and quiet. I usually go with friends, but this one time, I decided to go solo. Big mistake. It was a Friday, and I had the day off from work. The weather was perfect for a hike. Clear skies, not too hot, just right. I decided to head out to this trail I'd heard about, but never tried. It was supposed to be one of those hidden gems, not too crowded, lots of wildlife, great views. I packed my backpack with the usual: water, snacks, a map, and my phone. I made sure it was fully charged, just in case. I got to the trailhead around noon. There were a few cars parked there, but not too many. I thought about leaving a note in my car saying where I was going, just in case. But then I figured I'd be back before dark. I mean, I'd been hiking for years, and I knew how to handle myself out there. So I grabbed my backpack, locked the car, and started down the trail. The first part of the hike was just as nice as I'd hoped. The path was well marked, and I didn't run into anyone else. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. The trees were tall and dense, their leaves creating a canopy overhead that made the light all soft and dappled. I could hear birds chirping and the occasional rustle of something in the bushes, probably just a squirrel or a rabbit. I hiked for about an hour, just enjoying the scenery, before I decided to take a break. I found a nice spot near a small stream and sat down to eat one of the sandwiches I'd brought. As I sat there, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet, really. No birds, no rustling, just the sound of the water trickling over rocks. It was almost like the whole forest was holding its breath. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the time of day or something. After my break, I got back on the trail. I'd planned to hike a loop that would take me to a scenic overlook, then circle back to the trailhead. But as I was walking, I came across a narrow, overgrown path that veered off to the right. It didn't look like part of the main trail. It was barely visible, just a faint line through the underbrush. I don't know why, but I felt this urge to follow it. Maybe it was the promise of discovering something new, something that wasn't on the map. So I turned off the main trail and started down this narrow path. The deeper I went, the more overgrown it became. Branches brushed against my arms, and I had to duck under low-hanging limbs. The light filtering through the trees seemed to dim, and I started to feel a little uneasy. The path wasn't marked, and I hadn't seen any trail markers in a while. I thought about turning back, but I convinced myself to keep going. I was sure it would loop around or lead me to something interesting. After another 15 minutes of walking, I came across a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Weathered wood, windows broken, roof sagging. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it. Part of me wanted to go check it out, maybe take some pictures to show my friends. But another part of me, a part that was getting louder by the second, told me to turn around and leave. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached the cabin slowly, my footsteps crunching on the dead leaves. I reached the front door, which was hanging open on one hinge, and peered inside. The interior was dark, but I could make out some broken furniture, a table with one leg missing, and what looked like old, tattered blankets on the floor. There was a smell too, musty and stale, like the place hadn't been aired out in years. I took a step inside, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. That's when I saw it. Carvings on the walls. At first I thought they were just random scratches, but as I looked closer, I realized they were symbols. Strange, twisted shapes that didn't look like anything I'd seen before. They covered every inch of the walls, from floor to ceiling. My unease was turning into full-blown anxiety now. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I decided I'd seen enough and turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a sound behind me. It was faint, like a whisper, but I couldn't make out any words. I froze, my heart pounding, and listened. There it was again, a low, murmuring sound, coming from the far corner of the cabin. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I felt like something was there, watching me. I backed out of the cabin, my eyes still on that dark corner. As soon as I was outside, I turned and started walking quickly back toward the trail. I didn't run, but I moved fast, my heart racing, my ears straining for any sound. The forest felt different now, darker, more closed in. Every shadow looked like it could be hiding something. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. After what felt like forever, I finally found the main trail again. Relief washed over me, but I still couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the empty trail stretching out behind me. I picked up the pace, practically speed walking back to the trailhead. I was about halfway there when I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. Footsteps behind me on the path. They were faint, but definitely there, matching my pace. I stopped, holding my breath. and the footsteps stopped too. The forest was silent again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I started walking again, faster this time, and so did the footsteps. They were closer now, coming from just behind me. I wanted to run, but I was afraid that if I did, whatever was behind me would start running too. I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. I could see the parking lot up ahead through the trees, just a little further. Finally, I broke into a run, sprinting the last stretch of the trail. I burst into the clearing of the parking lot and spun around, looking back down the path. There was no one there. The trail was empty, silent, like it had been all along. My car was the only one left in the parking lot. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so much I could barely get the door open. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the trailhead one last time. That's when I saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the fading light. He was too far away for me to see his face clearly, but I could tell he was watching me. My heart was still racing as I drove away, and I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him following me, but there was nothing. I didn't stop driving until I got home. I locked all the doors and checked the windows, trying to calm myself down. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just some guy out for a walk, maybe another hiker who got curious about the cabin too. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I'd been hiking for years, but I'd never felt anything like that before. I couldn't get the image of that man out of my head, the way he just stood there, watching me from the edge of the woods. I tried to forget about it, but every time I went hiking after that, I'd find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there. I haven't gone back to that trail since. I still love hiking, still go out into the woods, but I stick to the well-known paths now, the ones with lots of people around. Maybe it was all just my imagination. Maybe there was nothing to be afraid of, but I can't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there that day, watching, waiting, and I don't ever want to find out what it was.